Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Primetime at the Bethel Library. Primetime is a collaboration between the Friends of the Bethel University Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus, and celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. We archive videos of past presentations. If you'd like to explore them, you can find them on the Bethel University Digital Library YouTube channel or in the Spark Digital Archive. Join us on Thursday, November 7th, that's next week, at 1:20 when Assistant Professor of General Studies and Intro to Wellbeing Coordinator Dr. Michelle Steffenhagen presents a talk about teaching program about ways to integrate well-being practices into the classroom and courses. This afternoon, in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, we welcome Dr. Juan Hernández, professor in the Department of Biblical and Theological Studies. His work with the Hispanic community has been an enormous blessing to Bethel and to the many students and pastors he has taught. Today he will present The Triumph of the Vernacular, the Rise, Dissemination, and Transformative Power of the Bible in Spanish. Join me in welcoming him.
Am I on? Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Good morning. It's a privilege to be here. Extraordinary honor, actually, to be able to share with you. This material, believe it or not, is, despite the fact that I'm Hispanic, is brand new to me. As most of you know, most of my work has to do with manuscripts, Greek manuscripts of Revelation and stuff like that. And I never really explored the heritage of the Spanish Bible. The opportunity came in 2022 when I was invited to go to the Museum of the Bible. They wanted to have a Hispanic Heritage celebration, and they kind of left it up to me, what do you want to do? And I've never done anything other than be Hispanic, right? And so, and I wasn't going to make tamales or wear a sombrero or teach you how to dance or anything like that, the typical stuff. So I thought, well, let me look around the museum and see if I get any ideas. This was in June. I was there for another paper, and the presentation was supposed to be for October. And it was there that I encountered one of the first translations of the Bible into Spanish, the Greek New Testament into Spanish. They had it, right? And I looked at it, and I realized, look, I've never asked about where my Bible comes from. I mean, I could tell you what the Greek says in any passage and translate it and exegete it and all kinds of stuff that we do here as biblical scholars. But my own heritage, my own language, the Bible that I used and love so much, you ask, where'd it come from? I don't know, God, right? That's about it, right? So this information literally is 2 years old. So probably it's about this deep in terms of knowledge, right? At least it's all brand new. But I hope you'll appreciate the journey. The best way I can think of doing this is literally just to ask, when was the first one? What was it like? And what did it lead to? And that's basically where we'll go. So the triumph of the vernacular. Make sure I got this. This is okay. Good. Make sure it's all set. Okay. It's hard to imagine that translating the Bible into any language other than Latin was once punishable by death. In fact, simply possessing a version of the Bible in the vernacular, again, in anything other than the Latin Vulgate, could prove dangerous, if not hazardous, to your health. Spanish language translations were no exception. In 1516, Juan Hernández, whom I can only assume was my cousin, was executed for smuggling copies of the New Testament in Spanish into Seville, and of all things, wine casks. As it would happen, a copy of that very edition of the Bible, El Nuevo Testamento de Nuestro Señor y Salvador Jesucristo, was on display at the Museum of the Bible where I first saw it. A version whose existence I was utterly unaware of prior to visiting the museum in June 2022. A version which was translated by Juan Pérez de Piñera. So it was both of my names right there. Interestingly, but perhaps no surprise to anyone, far from stymieing the production of translations of the Bible into Spanish, opposition proved to be an accelerant. Spanish Bible translations proliferated in the face of hostilities, and the very edition that was once targeted for confiscation and burning would go on to influence future editions of the Spanish Bible, most notably the Reina Valera translation of 1602, an extraordinarily popular Bible that was published well before the King James Version and has been released in multiple editions throughout the years, an edition that continues to be widely used today throughout much of the Spanish-speaking world. But as I noted, I had no prior knowledge of that early edition of the New Testament by Juan Pérez de Pineda, much less the circumstances surrounding its translation or the fate of those who risked life and limb to bring us the Bible in Spanish. In fact, it initially seemed counterintuitive to me that of all places, Spain, the very cradle of the Spanish language, a translation of the Bible into its native tongue was considered contraband, or worse, punishable by death. And of course, it is only all the more striking to find that one shares a surname with the very individual who had been executed for having brought New Testaments into the Iberian Peninsula. In those circumstances, sharing a name with Juan Hernández is an uncomfortable reminder that before an accident of history, there go I. It's the kind of Hispanic heritage detail that is best celebrated at a distance, as an example of the courage and heroism, but certainly not the kind of fate one would wish for oneself. That kind of valor is best appreciated from far away and on the pages of history. And yet the sobering encounter with my namesake was accompanied by another realization, this time in the form of a question. How is it that I had never heard of the Spanish translator Juan Pérez de Pineda or the Bible smuggler Juan Hernández? Or to put a finger on it, how is it that one could have spent a number of years studying the Bible in the original languages, examining the New Testament's manuscript tradition, and learning about the history of the Protestant Reformation, and yet never have happened upon these names? The stories about the vernacular translations of Wycliffe, Luther, and Tyndale are of course well known and well rehearsed. Their contributions to the history and cultures of England and Germany are the stuff of every seminary education. But those of the priests and reformers of the Spanish Peninsula are seldom, if ever, mentioned. And this, despite the fact that a number of those who translated the Bible were not only contemporaries of the most well-known Protestant reformers, but even had contact with them during critical moments in history. The narratives, as I had learned them, appeared to have had some gaps. But perhaps even more alarming on a personal level, this paper's full of alarms, was the fact that as a bilingual and bicultural person of Puerto Rican descent, I had been reading, studying, and teaching from the Bible in Spanish for years. In fact, the 1960 edition of the Reina Valera proved to be critical to my own development. Not only did it provide me with the nourishment, guidance, and inspiration necessary for a life of faith, but it had also furnished the very language structures that would frame and organize my thinking. It had become a model of how the language itself could be spoken in its purest and most virtuous forms. The cadences of the Reina Valera with its rhythmic structures echoed in the spaces I occupied in my youth. And yet, I could not tell you how we got that Bible or why. That was simply never a part of the curriculum. Different questions were being asked. Different interests drove the discussion. And different heritages were being celebrated, remembered, and granted legitimacy in the institutions I attended. The good news, of course, is that this glaring omission provides the perfect foil for the pursuit of our topic during this Hispanic Heritage Celebration, namely the history of the Bible in Spanish. The very first renderings of the Bible into Spanish were undertaken long before the Spanish Inquisition and its wholesale objection to vernacular translations. This opposition would last from the 15th to the 19th centuries, almost 400 years, and would be a major reason for the stalling of the Protestant Reformation in Spain. The first translations, however, date from the 13th century and come to us from a time when few would object to rendering the biblical text in the vernacular. Most of these translations would have been made from the Latin Vulgate, although some will have come from the original languages themselves, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. The earliest text to contain selections of the Bible translated into Spanish is La Hacienda de Ultramar, an early and colorful travel guide to the Holy Land, and one of the most important medieval texts in the Iberian Peninsula. La Hacienda de Ultramar is actually the first work on record to be written entirely in Spanish prose. The work dates from the 13th century and reproduces the structure of well-known pilgrim narratives from the Middle Ages. La Hacienda de Ultramar is therefore not a record of an actual pilgrimage or trip to Palestine, but it does showcase how the lore of Eastern geography was promoted on the Iberian Peninsula. The work itself appears to be a copy of a 12th century exemplar, now lost and probably originally written in Latin. The biblical passages in La Hacienda de Ultramar, however, are translated from the Hebrew with contributions from the Latin Vulgate, and their selection is entirely determined by the geography of the Holy Land. Alongside La Hacienda de Ultramar, we know of the existence of another early 13th century translation. This one, however, would be of a biblical book rather than a medieval pilgrimage, and it would be undertaken by Hermann el Alemán, or Herman the German. So called, of course, because he was born in Germany. As you can see, what a looker. There he is, Herman. Herman el Alemán was the bishop of Astorga, Spain, and he belonged to the legendary school of translators in Toledo, long renowned as a center of philosophical learning and translation activities. This was also the city where the first renderings of the Bible into Spanish were made. Herman himself translated the Hebrew book of Psalms into Spanish, but that translation regrettably has been lost. Herman el Alemán is nonetheless also known for having translated the works of Aristotle, as well as those of Avicenna and Averroes, the famous Muslim philosopher and physician. And these, of course, still exist. Despite the loss of Herman de Alemán's the translation of the Psalms, the 13th century also affords us another set of biblical exemplars in Spanish, namely the so-called Biblias Romanceadas, which are essentially early translations of the Bible into a Romance language, in this case, Spanish. They are romanceadas because of their connection to the language of Rome, that is to say, Latin, and therefore represent a later stage or vulgarization of the language. Las Biblias Romanceadas are among the earliest examples of Spanish literature in prose. And unlike the Hacienda de Ultramar, they translate whole books of the Bible into Spanish, not just select passages. Significantly, a number of these Biblias or Biblias Romanceadas appear to reflect the Spanish of the 12th century, even if the manuscripts are from the 13th. Among Las Biblias Romanceadas, one of the earliest examples is known as La Biblia Pre-Alfonsina. This Bible is preserved in two separate manuscripts. The first manuscript has Proverbs to Revelation and dates to the 13th century. The second manuscript preserves Leviticus to the book of Psalms and dates to the 15th century. Both of these are translations of the Latin Vulgate with contributions from other biblical languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. The label Pre-Alfonsina simply means that the Bible comes from a period that precedes the reign of Alphonse X, the king of Castile. That king would commission his own Bible late in the 13th century, and it would be called La Biblia Alfonsina. That particular translation was published in 1280 and, as noted, was named after its patron Alphonse X. Alphonse X's specific goal was to write a history of the world, from Genesis to the life of King Ferdinand III, his father, in order to legitimize his own claim to the throne. This edition, officially known, is officially known as La Grande e General Historia, and it also appears to have been very popular and was revised continuously throughout the life of Alphonse X and after. The biblical text of La Biblia Alfonsina provides the structure for his historical account and covers both the Old and New Testaments. The Bible, however, appears to be one among many sources for the royal record and provides no dogmatic or theological commentary. That is to say that the Bible was primarily used as a historical source for royal legacy rather than as a religious source for the sake of piety. The translation itself was made from the Hebrew Bible along with a corrupted version of the Latin Vulgate. And yet, La Biblia Alfonsina has the distinction of being the first complete translation of the Bible into a Romance language, Spanish, and is therefore a pioneer among las Biblias romanceadas. From a slightly later period, about 2 centuries, we encounter another handful of Biblias romanceadas. The first is Codex 87. This is an interesting Biblia romanceada insofar as it comes to us in the form of a bilingual edition. This particular Bible dates from the 15th century and preserves the biblical text in parallel columns. Its form is not unique insofar as bilingual editions are also attested elsewhere in the manuscript tradition. However, this particular edition preserves the Latin Vulgate in the left column, while the right one has a Spanish translation of it. In other words, it is the inclusion of the Spanish that is new, and therefore makes it the first bilingual edition of a Bible romanceada to appear. Codex 87 preserves the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, as well as the minor prophets, along with the book of Maccabees. Everything but the book of Maccabees is translated directly from the Hebrew, with Maccabees, of course, being translated from the Latin Vulgate. This particular Biblia romanceada also appears to have a complex textual history, where part of the translation is related to La Biblia del Alba, another 15th century Biblia romanceada. Turning our attention to La Biblia del Alba, here we have a translation of the Old Testament made directly from the Hebrew. Until the appearance of this particular edition, Spanish translations bore traces of the Hebrew Bible along with the Old Latin or Latin Vulgate. This translation, however, was to be based on the Hebrew alone. For this task, Moisés Aragel, a well-known and celebrated Jewish scholar from Guadalajara, Spain, was commissioned. The project, from its inception, was a joint one. Aragel's translation was done under the supervision of the Catholic Church and Catholic scholars, principally because he was a Jewish rabbi. And translating the scriptures for the Catholic Church could prove controversial. In fact, Aragel was initially reluctant to accept the commission and had to be reassured that his life would not be at risk before undertaking it. Two of the reasons for recruiting Aragel to provide a new translation of the Bible or the Old Testament into Spanish are articulated by Alonso de Guzman. The first, as far as the Spanish translations of his day were, was that su romance es muy corrupto. That is to say, their Spanish translations were corrupt. And the second reason was that their Bibles were in dire need of la glosa para los pasos oscuros. Their Bibles were in need of glosses for obscure passages. Glosses, of course, are a form of medieval commentary that often accompany the text of Scripture for the sake of greater clarity. With Aragel's acceptance of the commission, the translation was finalized in 1433, just 10 years after it was begun. And the last 3 years of the project were spent correcting and illuminating the manuscript. The translation itself took place in Maqueda, Spain, while the illustrations were done in Toledo. Strikingly, La Biblia del Alba would fade into obscurity until it resurfaced almost 200 years later during the height of the Spanish Inquisition in 1622. As such, that translation was in danger of being destroyed as a Judeo-Romance translation, that is, a Jewish translation. All things Jewish, of course, were in danger during the Spanish Inquisition, particularly their scriptures. In 1492, for example, 20 volumes of the Spanish Bible were destroyed in Salamanca as heréticos e erróneos, heretical and erroneous, because they departed from the Catholic tradition and were translated from Hebrew exemplars. That is to say, the Spanish translations were Jewish and therefore had to be destroyed. La Biblia del Alba, fortunately, would escape this fate. To be sure, there are also about a dozen other extant Biblias romanceadas to this day in libraries across Portugal and Spain. A large number of these are housed at La Biblioteca de San Lorenzo del Escorial, which is why these translations are also known as Las Biblias Escorialenses. Their existence, of course, attests to a widespread interest in having a vernacular translation of the Bible at that time. So much so that two separate 13th century councils, El Concilio de Tolosa and El Concilio de Tarragona, had earlier called for their confiscation and burning. These prohibitions, however, appear to have fallen on deaf ears as they continue to surface periodically in various places. The relative freedom to produce Biblias romanceadas would come to an eventual and then an abrupt end in the 16th and 17th centuries. Translations would continue to be produced, of course, as human nature naturally persists in the face of opposition. But it could only be done surreptitiously and on the wrong side of the law, and that at considerable risk to life and limb. What initially began as a steadily increasing set of prohibitions in the 16th century would eventually turn into outright persecution against anyone who would translate, distribute, or possess any biblical texts in Spanish during that period. The problem, of course, was not simply that the Bible was in the vernacular, but its tendency, as it was supposed, to lead to heresy and Protestant ideas. Late in the 15th century, with the reign of Ferdinand de Aragon and Isabel de Castilla of Spain, otherwise known as Los Reyes Católicos, the groundwork for the aggressive opposition to vernacular translations would start to be laid, even if not decidedly at the time. This period would experience a number of seismic shifts, including Spain's consolidation of power in 1469 with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel, the reactivation of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 in order to purge Catholicism of heretics and Jews in Spain, the reconquest of Granada from the Moors in 1492, as well as the forced conversion of Jews and Muslims to Christianity or face expulsion in 1492 and 1496, respectively. Of course, the invention of the printing press decades before, in 1450, would also set the stage for an additional dimension of religious conflict by facilitating the printing and distribution of vernacular translations of the Bibles in the 16th century and later. That invention, coupled with the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation in 1517 and its insistence on reading the Bible in the vernacular, would precipitate a violent response from both the Catholic Church and European monarchs. Lists of prohibited books would begin to be published and circulated, the first of which appears in 1529 by King Richard VIII of England. In 1546, Charles V, the Emperor of Germany and King of Spain, would also publish a list of prohibited books, a list that was adopted and published by the Spanish Inquisition in 1551. As far as Spanish translations were concerned, the 1559 edition states that La Biblia en nuestro vulgar, that is the Bible in our language, o en otro cualquier, or in any other, traducida en toda parte o en parte, translated in whole or in part, como no esté en hebraico, chaldeo, griego, o latín, as it is not in Hebrew, Chaldean, Greek, or Latin, está prohibido, is prohibited. Interestingly, the banning of vernacular Bibles is followed immediately by a prohibition of an additional set of problematic works, in particular those of Erasmus, the famous Dutch humanist, whose works were actually quite popular in Spain at the time. The prohibition in question reads, además de obras originales, incluye traducciones de castellano como las obras de Erasmo. In addition to original works, the prohibition includes translations into Spanish of works such as those of Erasmus. These prohibitions, along with many others, would apply to the whole Roman Catholic world once Pope Paul IV published his Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. But as noted, during this period of increased intolerance, Spanish Bibles or the translation of biblical passages into Spanish were still being produced and circulated. During the earlier part of the 16th century, vernacular translations faced little opposition. Those that surfaced later in the 16th century, however, would be linked with heresy and Protestantism. In fact, even Spanish translations that were originally sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church and monarchs could find themselves banned at a later period. Case in point. In 1514, Ambrosio de Montesino, a Spanish priest, who actually served at the pleasure of Isabel and Ferdinand, published a work entitled Epístolas y Evangelios por todo el año, Epistles and Gospels for the whole year. That publication, which appears to be a revision of an earlier work, is a translation from the Latin to the Spanish of a devotional that cites over 800 passages from the Old and New Testaments. This Catholic devotional thus offered laypersons an opportunity to follow the Latin text of the Mass in Spanish, and even went through multiple editions due to its popularity. That is, until it was banned by the Spanish Inquisition and put on the list of prohibited books in 1612. And this, despite the fact that it had been commissioned by the most Catholic of all kings, Ferdinand de Aragon, only 100 years earlier. The problem, of course, was that the work was en el vulgar, in the vernacular, and there was no tolerance for such works on the peninsula once the Protestant Reformation was in full swing. But before the darkness completely engulfs our history of the Bible in Spanish, there is one publication that represents a benchmark in the history of Spanish textual scholarship. This, of course, is a reference to the Complutensian Polyglot, a landmark 5-volume work that prints the Bible in its original languages. The Complutensian Polyglot was published in Alcalá, Spain in 1520 and was intended to serve as a translation tool. The name of the Bible reflects its form and origin. Polyglot, of course, refers to its multiple languages, while Complutensian refers to the city where it was produced. The moniker Complutensian actually comes from the Latin Complutum, which was the original Roman settlement where Alcalá now stood. Thus, the Complutensian Polyglot simply means the multilingual Bible from Alcalá. The multiple languages of the Polyglot, as noted, were not modern, and therefore did not include a vernacular translation into Spanish. Rather, the Complutensian Polyglot was the first printed text of the Bible in its original languages, and it was a product of Spain. Specifically, the 5 volumes were arranged as follows. The first 4 volumes preserve the entire Old Testament in 3 columns, with the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Latin Vulgate, and the Hebrew text side by side. The 4th volume contains the entire New Testament in 2 columns, Greek and Latin. And the final pages of the 4th volume and the entire 5th one contain a Hebrew and Aramaic dictionary, a Hebrew grammar, and even a Greek lexicon. And as if that weren't enough, there was even an Aramaic translation of the Pentateuch on the bottom half of the page in the 1st volume, which is also translated into Latin. A team of world-class experts worked on different parts of the text, including the renowned philologist Antonio de Nebrija, who had produced the first grammar in any modern European language, as well as the first dictionary of the Spanish language. The entire project was conceived, led, and financed by Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, who sought to revive the study of the scriptures at La Universidad Complutense, which he had founded in 1508. The polyglot thus represents the height of Spanish textual scholarship and typographic achievement in the 16th century. Interestingly, Erasmus had also been invited to form part of the team, but he had declined. This was, of course, long before he had been targeted by the Spanish Inquisition. He chose rather to focus on publishing the first Greek New Testament. Now, it must also be noted that this exceptionally bright spot of Spanish textual scholarship emerges against a very dark backdrop of the Spanish Inquisition. It is worth noting, for example, that alongside the undeniable industry, vision, and achievement of someone like Cardinal Cisneros, one must also reckon with the fact that he had served as the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, and that in that capacity he had descended mercilessly upon Jews and Marranos on the Iberian Peninsula, handing some 2,500 of them over to autos de fe, which in its most extreme form involved burnings at the stake. The cardinal had also forced the mass conversion of Muslims to Christianity in 1499 and had over 5,000 of their Arabic manuscripts destroyed by fire. This, of course, was in keeping with the objectives of the Spanish Inquisition, and as such, it was also a period of great destruction, death, and sorrow for countless outside of the Roman Catholic Church. There is simply no way around this uncomfortable fact. Returning to the translation of the Bible into Spanish, the very first rendering of the entire Greek New Testament into the vernacular was undertaken by Francisco de Encinas in 1543. His edition was published outside of Spain, specifically in Antwerp, and was titled El Nuevo Testamento de Nuestro Redentor y Salvador Jesucristo, traducido de griego en lengua castellana. That is, translated from Greek into the Castilian language. That, of course, was a first. Prior to the appearance of Encinas' edition, only parts of the Greek New Testament had been translated into Spanish, such as the 16th century translation of Matthew and Paul's letters by Juan de Valdés, which you guys probably associate with coffee. Before that, however, there were other translations of the New Testament, but they were principally of the Latin Vulgate. Juan de Valdés, incidentally, was friends with Erasmus, and he had even used Erasmus's Greek New Testament for his own translation. Returning to Francisco de Encinas, his translation is also based on Erasmus's Greek text with some Latin influence. The translation would also prove influential insofar as it would be used by Casiodoro de Reina for his own translation of the Bible in 1569, otherwise known as La Biblia del Oso, the Bible of the Bear. Casiodoro de Reina, of course, is one of the two names associated with the famed Reina Valera Bible, which would be published in 1602. In 1533, a new translation of the Hebrew Bible was published in Spanish. This Bible, however, is the product of the Sephardic community, which had been exiled from Spain in 1492. Specifically, two Portuguese scholars, Jewish scholars, had undertaken this translation under the Duchy of Ferrar, hence the name La Biblia de Ferrara. In fact, the Duke of Ferrar protected this Bible against confiscation and destruction by the Spanish authorities. As a result, it was printed many times and used for centuries. Interestingly, La Biblia de Ferrara would also serve as a source for the Old Testament section of Casiodoro de Reina's 1569 Bible. In 1556, just a couple of decades after the appearance of La Biblia de Ferrara, the second full translation of the Greek New Testament into Spanish was published. This was the edition mentioned at the outside by Juan Pérez de Piñera, who incidentally was also a follower of Erasmus's ideas, and even sought their diffusion in Spain. Piñera was also connected to Juan de Valdés, as well as Casiodoro de Reina and Cipriano de Valera, all of whom were translators, at least initially, reformers within the Catholic Church. Like Encinas' New Testament, Piñera's was also published abroad, this time in Geneva, Switzerland, where he had to flee from the Spanish Inquisition. There he also translated and published John Calvin's Geneva Catechism into Spanish, as well as wrote La Epistola Consolatoria to encourage Spaniards who suffered in the hands of the Inquisition. Up until now, then, we have witnessed a number of firsts in the history of the translation of the Bible into Spanish. The first, of course, was the emergence of Spanish prose in the 12th century and the 13th century as well, such as we witnessed in La Hacienda de Ultramar. There were also the first translations of the Bible into Spanish from the Latin in Las Biblias Romanceadas of the 13th and 15th centuries, including the first bilingual edition to feature both languages side by side. We then saw the first full translation of the Hebrew Bible into Spanish in La Biblia del Alba, published in the 15th century. And finally, the publication of the first full translation of the Greek New Testament by Francisco de Encina in the first half of the 16th century, followed by the publication of Juan Pérez de Pineda's edition, both of which used Erasmus's Greek text. It would not be until the second half of the 16th century, however, that we would come to see the first full Bible translated from its original languages into Spanish, all in one volume. And that distinction would belong to Casiodoro de Reina. Casiodoro de Reina was born in 1520 in the province of Badajoz, Spain. Throughout his life, he had dedicated himself to the study of Scripture and, not surprisingly, became a monk in 1527. It was during this period that he was influenced by Lutheran ideas and began to follow the Protestant Reformation. Eventually, Reina and about a dozen other monks from the Hieronymite monastery in San Isidor were suspected of Lutheran tendencies and forced to flee, first to Geneva and then to London, where Reina would serve as a pastor of Protestant refugees from Spain. The Spanish Inquisition eventually declared Casiodoro de Reina a leader of heretics and placed his writings on the index of prohibited books. An auto de fe was even carried out against him in 1562, and an effigy of him was burned in public. It was during this period of exile that Casiodoro de Reina began to work on his Spanish translation, which culminated with the publication of La Biblia del Oso in 1569. The nickname derives from the fact that the original printing of the Bible featured a bear eating honey on the front cover. The actual title of the Bible is La Biblia, que es los sacros libros del Viejo y Nuevo Testamento trasladado en español, and it was published in Basel, Switzerland. As noted, it was the first Spanish translation to feature both the Old and New Testament together, each translated from the original languages. For the Old Testament, Reina used the 1524 Rabbinic Bible to preserve the 11th century Masoretic text of Codex Leningrad. He also consulted La Biblia de Ferrar for his Spanish translation. As for the New Testament, Erasmus's Greek text was used, as well as the Spanish translations of Francisco de Encina and Juan de Valdés, who incidentally also funded Reina's new Spanish translation. Perhaps it is also worth noting and highlighting that Casiodoro de Reina suffered at the hands of both the Spanish Inquisition and the Geneva Calvinists. In fact, Reina would write a book against the Spanish Inquisition, the first to be published in Spanish, and he would also translate a book critical of Calvin in Spanish. Reina would eventually go on to become fully Lutheran and even translated Luther's catechism into Latin, French, and Dutch. Shortly after Reina's death in 1594, in fact, just 2 years later, Cipriano de Valera would publish El Nuevo Testamento de Nuestro Señor Jesucristo, which appears to be a slightly revised version of Casiodoro de Reina's New Testament. In 1602, Valera would broaden his efforts and publish a revision of Reina's whole Bible, La Biblia del Oso, and introduce a number of key changes which appear to depart from Reina's original vision for the Bible. It's hard to imagine, however, that any of these changes would have pleased Casiodoro de Reina, particularly the updating of his notes, since Valera did not simply remove some of them but added others that were in line with the Geneva Calvinists, the very ones who had caused Reina difficulty while he was in exile. However, despite the removal of Reina's name from the Bible, this edition would become known as La Reina Valera and emerge as the most widely read and accepted Bible in the Spanish-speaking Protestant world. Up until the 18th century, almost all of the official translations of the Bible into Spanish were published abroad. that is, outside of Spain. The Inquisition had successfully enforced the prohibition of vernacular Bibles on the Iberian Peninsula for 3 centuries. All of that changed, however, with the publication of La Biblia Vulgata Latina traducida en español. Is that it? Okay. That is, the Latin Vulgate Bible translated into Spanish. That translation was undertaken by Felipe Sio de San Miguel, a Catholic priest, and would become known as La Biblia del Padre Sio. It was published in 1793. La Biblia del Padre Sio would then become the first publication of the entire Bible in Spanish sanctioned by the Roman Catholic authorities on Spanish soil, a first. With the dawning of the 19th century, a number of developments would signal new directions in the translations of the Bible into Spanish. Among these are the greater participation of Catholics, as well as the rise of the national Bible societies. Perhaps one of the most significant developments, at least in terms of symbolism, is the production of the very first translation of the Bible into Spanish in Latin America. This is a distinction that would belong to La Versión de Mariano Galván, which was published in 1836. What is important about this particular translation, however, is not the underlying text, which was a Spanish translation of a French text based on the Latin Vulgate, but where the Bible was produced, that is, Latin America. And this was a first. It is further noteworthy that apart from Mariano Galván, 2 other Mexicans also served on the translation team, Manuel Carpillo and Anastasio Ochoa. This was not only a new development, but the beginning of a trend that would stretch into the 20th century and beyond. Other noteworthy translations during this period include La Biblia Torres Amat, published in 1823, Las Escrituras del Nuevo Pacto, published in 1858 and 1871, La Versión de Guillermo Rule, a translation of the 4 Gospels published in 3 parts, the last of which appeared in 1880, and finally La Versión Moderna de Enrique Pratt, published by the American Bible Society in 1893. Of course, there were a number of other translations published during the 19th century, including about a half a dozen revised editions of the Reina Valera Bible. This sampling, however, is sufficient to illustrate the accelerated pace and diversity of Spanish translations, as well as their growth from a regional and European phenomenon to one that now spanned the globe. The fevered pitch and pace of Spanish translations, of course, would continue into the 20th century. One of the first translations to surface during this period was La Versión Hispano-Americana, published in 1916 by the British and American Bible Societies. The edition marked a new era in Spanish translation insofar as it was undertaken by an international team of scholars from 3 regions: Spain, Latin America, and North America. This edition also made use of the Nestle Greek New Testament, which represented the state of the art in critical editions at the time. It is also worth noting that there were about as many Spanish translations of the Bible outside of Spain as within it. Argentina, Chile, Mexico, the United States, France, and Israel were all publishing Spanish Bibles at the time. Argentina appears to have had the most Bibles published during the 20th century, that is, apart from Spain. Most of these appear to be the work of Catholic priests or scholars working with the original languages. Among those translated by Catholics are La Biblia de Huneman, La Biblia Plantense, La Sagrada Biblia Más Bella del Mundo, la Biblia, el Libro de la Nueva Alianza, and La Biblia del Pueblo de Dios. Falling outside the pattern of Catholic translations are La Versión de Pablo Bison, which was undertaken by a Swiss Baptist missionary, and La Biblia Duhovne, La Biblia Judía Rosenblum, both of which were translations of the Hebrew Bible into Spanish by Jewish scholars. It is also worth noting that the flurry of Catholic translations is a clear byproduct of the papal encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, which had authorized modern translations on the basis of the original languages in 1943. In fact, beginning in 1944 and stretching into 1993, over a dozen Spanish Bibles appeared on the Iberian Peninsula, most of which were translated from the original languages. Translations of the Latin Vulgate, of course, still appeared, but by and large, most Catholic scholars were now working with the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic languages. There was also a growing recognition at this time that the Spanish of the Iberian Peninsula differed from that of Latin America. This made it necessary at times for the same Spanish Bible to be released in two different versions. In 1999, at the very end of the 20th century and on the eve of the 21st, we witnessed the appearance of La Nueva Versión Internacional. This particular edition follows the dynamic equivalent translation method of the New International Version, its English counterpart. This means that the translators would attempt to strike a balance between preserving the meaning of the original while also attending to the needs of a modern language, in this case Spanish. This translation would also rely on the latest edition of the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. La Nueva Versión Internacional would also stand in a decidedly Protestant tradition, particularly the evangelical Protestant tradition. But what is perhaps most fascinating about La Nueva Versión Internacional is its truly international cast of Latin American scholars. 10 countries and 1 territory are represented in this edition. These include Argentina with 4 translators, Colombia with 3, Mexico with 3, Chile with 2, Peru with 2, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Guatemala, and Cuba, each with 1, the United States with 2, and finally Puerto Rico with 3. In other words, all of the contributors are from the Americas, North, Central, and South. La Nueva Versión Internacional, therefore, is a world away from the original European context of the first translations of the Bible in Spanish. The story, of course, goes on, especially as we now make our way through the 21st century, and many of the trends we have already observed will no doubt continue as well. The Reina Valera, for example, has already been published in 3 new and very distinct editions in 2010, 2011, and 2012, and that despite the fact that it has been revised countless times since the 17th century. This is likely to continue. But here, there is also an extraordinary opportunity for us to revisit an old story that appears to have been forgotten if it was ever known. It is clear now, however, that the history of the translation of the Bible into Spanish is not an idiosyncratic and separate part of the record, but rather an integral part of a larger cycle of events, particularly during the Protestant Reformation. The names of Erasmus, Bucer, Melanchthon, and John Calvin, as noted, are all well known and studied across seminaries everywhere. But few will have known about the pervasive influence of Erasmus in Spain, or of the use of his Greek New Testament for contraband Spanish translations, or the degree which translators from the peninsula were in contact with well-known reformers. Even fewer still will have been aware of the fact that Francisco de Encinas, who gave us the first Greek New Testament translated into Spanish, had gone to Wittenberg to study with Melanchthon, or that he had spent time with Martin Bucer at his home, or that he had even corresponded with John Calvin during the height of the Reformation. Knowing these connections, however, matters, and they make an extraordinary difference in the kind of heritages we celebrate, remember, and legitimize. And this is particularly true for the history of the Spanish Bible and its transmission, which matters to so many across the world. We are fortunate then, on an occasion such as this, to be able to retrieve a critical part of that history and highlight it as part of our Hispanic Heritage Celebration. Thank you.